Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the Carriage and Partners webinar series. My name is Renisa Peterson, and I am a consultant with the firm. As part of our vision to transform the leadership landscape, we have been working on a series of leadership events, including this webinar series. Thank you to everyone who has been attending our webinar series over the last few months. They have certainly picked up momentum and sparked conversations online, spanning topics on leadership in crisis, talent development, CEO succession, and more recently, a series of leadership conversations with leaders who bring a global and local lens. We are delighted you are joining us today for our webinar with Joanne Fair regarding the future of work. This is a critical topic in the current context of COVID-19, albeit the topic has been gaining traction as an important discussion for the last couple of years. Jo brings more than 20 years' experience in senior roles across New Zealand, Australia, Europe, and Southeast Asia, working with a number of well-known organizations both domestically and globally. As the global head of HR for Fonterra, Jo led the people strategy for more than 22,000 employees across 50-plus markets. She has also led significant business units in both B2B and FMCG industries and has governance experience. Passionate about diversity and inclusion, her combination of commercial experience and people focus also gives her a deep understanding of the challenges businesses face in preparing for the future. She is a co-founder and director of FutureWork Studio. For context on who is with us online as part of this community, we have over 100 people attending. Approximately 10% are CEOs, 20% are board directors and chairs, 10% are HR leaders, 5% are CFOs, and the rest are a cohort of senior executives from a diverse range of sectors and industries. Haere mai. Some housekeeping matters to address. Firstly, you have all joined this webinar on mute, so please rest assured you are not on video and you can sit back and relax. You will remain on mute by default, so no need to stress about background noise either. We will also be uploading a recording of this webinar to our website and also share the slide deck, so no need to worry about writing too many notes. Secondly, we encourage you to participate by asking questions throughout this session. On the bottom of your screen, there is a Zoom chat function Q&A. Please type in your questions and we will address the most popular ones during our panel session, which I will expand on shortly. Please can we request that you send your questions using the Q&A function instead of the Zoom chat function. Thirdly, we wanted to share the structure of our webinar today so you know what to expect. Following this introduction, Jo will be delivering a presentation on the future of work. Afterward, we will have a Q&A dialogue with Jo and Nick Edlin. Nick is a partner with the executive search practice, working across a diverse range of sectors, including government and iwi organizations, public and private sector businesses, and listed businesses. Prior to joining Carriage and Partners, he spent 8 years practicing law across New Zealand and the UK, and he was also a freelance sports journalist and writer for the New Zealand Herald. Following that, we will open the Q&A to participants. So without further ado, let's launch right in. Please welcome Jo.
Thanks, Renisa, and kia ora, everyone. Great to have the opportunity to have a dialogue with you today. I'm just going to share my slides. Okay, hopefully everyone can see those. Well, welcome, and great to have the opportunity to talk about leading in the future of work, which is one of my favourite topics, obviously, given FutureWork Studio and what we do, but also given my previous background in an area where there is just such huge opportunity for all of us as leaders in New Zealand. Oops. I want to kick off by just giving some context on why the future of work is important and why we are really starting to talk about it increasingly, not just from a way we work perspective, but also from future productivity and the importance from an economic perspective. Fundamentally, as we're all aware, the world is more complex, it's hyper-connected, and it's moving at pace. The reason for that is that we are now in an exponential world. So you will all have heard of Moore's law, the doubling of performance and the halving of cost in every period. What that drives is 10 times pace and 300 times scale. This is particularly an attribute of exponential technologies like artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, biotech, nanotechnology, AR, VR. All these technologies which are becoming increasingly ubiquitous. That's very important for us in the business world, because what these technologies do as they become increasingly affordable is they enable us to unlock new ways of solving problems, problems that previously we couldn't have comprehended how to resolve, now become accessible to businesses everywhere. And one of my favorite stories that really captures that is the story about Lowe's in the United States, which is a traditional hardware store, very traditional business that has started to look into the opportunities for exponential technologies in terms of their customer experience and also innovation. Lowe's has moved from a very traditional business to leveraging 3D technologies and working with NASA. So a couple of years ago, when the space station ran out of a critical wrench that they needed to fix something, Lowe's, this very real world grounded organization in the States, was able to use 3D printing technology to print in space the wrench that was needed to fix the issue. Something that in that business even 10 years ago would not have been imaginable. So exponential world and exponential technologies is opening up unforeseen opportunities. But it also creates a challenge for us to get our heads around, because when we look around our world on a day-to-day basis, we think in a very linear way, where we're programmed with our brains to think in a linear way. So we tend to expect that the way we've always done things, or what we've always experienced, will continue in the same path. And for that reason, we often under-anticipate the pace of change or the pace and impact of exponential technologies. Often this is coined the gradually, then suddenly paradox. Gradually, and often at a slower pace than in a linear world, technologies are developing and moving. And all of a sudden, there's this tipping point where suddenly technologies become ubiquitous. COVID has been a really great example in a non-technology sense for us to understand that. You know, it's only in January and February of this year that COVID seemed like a few cases in China, very far away from us here in New Zealand, something that we were monitoring, keeping an eye on. Today, there have been more than 12 million cases globally of COVID, something that would have been unimaginable just a short time ago. And that's because COVID has followed an exponential curve. The great thing about these technologies is they create huge opportunities. So for example, during COVID, the combination of AI, big data, and Internet of Things has enabled us to unlock and access the ability to treat and understand COVID in ways that we wouldn't have been able to before. There's a great study, for example, by one of the universities in the US, where they used biotechnology to track biomarkers. They used advanced data science and analytics to understand the data set and understand the implications, and then used predictive analytics linked to sensory machines to understand how to better diagnose people. So there is a huge wealth of opportunity in the way we can use these exponential technologies. However, they also bring ethical dilemmas and different challenges and different complexity. So for example, if contact tracing can be used to help COVID cases, what does it mean when employers are looking at activities of employees, or where police may be looking, as the case of this example in the US, of protesters in the Black Lives Matter marches, tracking their movements based on technologies that were developed for a different purpose. It's something that we need to be really mindful of when we start to look at the workplace too. Amazon are very well known for a study they did several years ago, where they used advanced data tools and data sets to look at predictive analytics for recruitment. They found, using their research and their smarts, that the most highest performing recruits that they could hire were typically Harvard educated, male and white. However, there's no surprise that that was the conclusion, because the data set that had been used reflected very much the way they had always recruited in the past. Therefore, there was an inherent bias in that data. So for us in the workplace and as leaders, while these technologies bring huge opportunity, there's also the very real ethical dilemmas and understanding of these technologies that are important to ensure we're making the right decisions. Those systemic biases challenge us at the very heart of society and do reflect back into the workplace. And increasingly, society is telling us that these biases are unacceptable. The opportunity we have with exponential technologies is to leverage those analytics in a positive way to better understand those biases and change the future. We know that better representation gives much better decision making and much wider perspectives. And ultimately that reflects in better business outcomes that more accurately reflect our consumer base and our society. But we need to be mindful and we need to be deliberate in the way we think about these technologies. We also have an environment where we have a new generation entering the workplace. I still go into workplaces where people are talking about millennials. The reality is that millennials now make up close to 50% of our working population and are the leaders in our businesses. So millennials are running our businesses, and the new generation is Gen Z. And this is a very different generation for us. The Gen Z, or digital natives, have grown up with a platform economy. They've grown up with completely transparent data. They've grown up in a world which is ambiguous and challenging. They've grown up inheriting some of the biggest challenges we've faced in history in terms of climate change. It's no wonder that this generation is also starting to have a very strong voice and a very informed voice. So as we think about the workplace and the implications of the future of work, some of what we need to be thinking about is how do we recognize these voices and listen? Because this new generation are not only our future employees, they're also our future consumers. And of course, COVID, so topical at the moment, is really in essence a fire drill for climate change. You know, we look at the implications of COVID, we look at the looming recession, you know, certainly here in New Zealand, already seeing some signs and globally even more concerning. And off the back of that, significant climate change. You know, for so long, climate change felt like something that was out there and perhaps not particularly relevant to the workplace. But as we face into an environment where water restrictions are in place here in Auckland due to the low levels of water in the dams, directly impacting the way businesses function. We look at the wildfires around the world. Alaska, for the first time in history, having wildfires last year and again this year, and obviously what happened in Australia earlier this year. When we start to look at the impact or potential impact on agriculture and horticulture, which are still the backbone of New Zealand's economy. And then when we look at the growing voices of our employees, of the new generation, of many of us around the need for change, these are all implications that impact on how we show up in the workplace. So these changes very much impact on the workplace and the way we work. One of the biggest impacts, obviously, is automation directly impacting on jobs. And this has been very topical for a long time. In the earlier days where we didn't have a very good understanding, there was a huge amount of scaremongering around what automation might mean globally, and there was a lot of talk of global recession. What we understand more now is that the automation that's coming through AI primarily is actually impacting on activities, but not whole jobs. So this is excellent research that formed part of work that McKinsey did for the Business Advisory Council back in 2019. And what their research showed was that around 50% of work activities can be automated. So perhaps a really obvious example of that is RPA, or robotic process automation, where a task within a finance function may be automated. A repetitive task, typically with a yes/no answer, can be automated very easily. However, the remainder of that role may be difficult to automate. And that's the big difference. Unlike earlier automation, particularly in a manufacturing environment where robotics came in and therefore whole job came out, we are now looking at a world where parts of jobs are automated. And in fact, what the McKinsey research showed is that less than 10% of roles globally can be fully automated using today's technologies. That's actually a very exciting opportunity for us, because what that means is we can become more productive, more efficient by automating parts of roles, and then leverage that capacity to actually create value and move up the value chain. And this is something that is probably not talked about enough in regards to RPA, which is still very much seen as cost out. When you look at the New Zealand landscape, particularly, what the McKinsey research also showed that net over the next decade, there would be around 700,000 jobs in aggregate that would go as a result of automation. But actually, 900,000 new jobs created, equally in terms of emerging areas like healthcare and service, which are becoming increasingly important, and through technology-enabled opportunities. So we have a very optimistic picture, notwithstanding, obviously, the current impacts of COVID. However, to make this shift, we do require new skills. What we are seeing is a real shift from physical and manual work and basic cognitive into the importance of social and emotional skill sets and technological skill sets. And an example that I often use with people is, one of my first jobs was working in a supermarket as a checkout operator. And showing my age back in that day, typically first thing I did when I came in was I learned the specials off by heart, because there was no automated system for specials. Then I sat down in front of my till and I manually punched in the prices as customers came through. The little white labels gave me the prices because there were no barcodes back then. Then I physically pushed the groceries down the travelator. There wasn't an automated travelator, and they were manually packed. That job still exists today. You can still be a checkout operator, so the job is there, but the requirements have fundamentally changed. Technology has automated a lot of those manual tasks, and the role is much more focused around customer service, engaging your customer, helping out in the self-help queue, for example, when things go wrong. So technology makes some aspects more efficient and changes the requirements for skills. And that's meant there's also a whole lot of new jobs emerging, jobs that we couldn't have imagined even a short time ago. Whether it's an SEO specialist who's helping you be top of the list when someone Googles your company, whether it's telemedicine, which has grown exponentially, obviously, through the latest COVID crisis, whether it's data scientists using advanced analytics and really looking at predictive analytics to make much better business decisions. And that's the really positive story around the impact in the workplace. But it also means that as leaders, we need to start thinking about how we invest in our workforce to better prepare for this future. We know too that complex issues will demand diverse skill sets and open minds. Many of the issues that we're facing into, whether it's ethical dilemmas or the cross-section of different technologies, or simply how we compete faster and in a more responsive way, require a diverse group of skills and understanding to come together. It's no longer sufficient to look at simple problems and simple solutions. We'll just get left behind. The increased pace also means we need much more collaboration. We need to be working across teams. We need to be really unlocking and leveraging all the talents that sit within our organisations. Yet today, we still manage our organisations very much like we did in the 1950s. Strict hierarchies, siloed business units, managers that are typically based on command and control. How big is your team? We need a real mindset shift to start to think about how do we be more nimble, how do we collaborate, how do we build multi-teams, How do we make sure that we're bringing those skill sets together to solve problems in different ways? So how do we do this? Well, it's not as big as it feels. You know, it's easy to look out into the world and it feels very complex. It feels like there is a lot of change happening. But actually preparing for the future of work is as simple as taking a few small steps. I love this cartoon that came out around the time of COVID, which really speaks to the fact that, you know, we have talked that digital transformation is years away, we don't need to change, it's always felt out there. And yet with the advent of COVID, overnight here in New Zealand, almost every organisation were able to put their staff working from home and carry on and still be productive. It actually was never about the technology, it was always about the mindset. So we do need to build resilient, responsive businesses to be able to respond to the emerging challenges around us, but also to leverage the emerging technologies. But the first steps don't need to be hard. It's as simple as looking for ways to harness diverse skills through collaboration. You know, what are steps in organisations we can take to really bring people together in different ways? And that starts obviously with ensuring we have diversity and inclusion. How do we make sure we have diverse voices that are not just present, but are actually included and able to be heard? How do we experiment and learn? You know, taking steps, small steps at times, and making mistakes, but that's okay. We learn and we reset and we go again. You know, how do we challenge hierarchy and silos and status? You know, we managed that way in the 1950s when we produced widgets in a very certain world. In the new world, we need networks, we need collaboration. So how do we rethink the way we structure organisations to make sure that we're really getting the best out of people and the best out of the organisation? How do we value contribution more and bring in engagement and ideas? How do we unlock all that richness that already sits within our organisations? How do we invest in upskilling? And the Business Advisory Council had some great suggestions around how we invest in training. It's much more effective, for example, to invest upfront in reskilling your workforce than to be paying for exiting staff and then bringing in new staff and having that productivity challenge. So how do we think differently around the way we approach upskilling? And how do we create trust and clarity? Because so much of the unlock rests on our ability to give trust and receive trust and create clarity. This statistic from the Harvard Business Review is incredibly powerful. 9 out of 10 people are willing to earn less money to do more meaningful work. Yet only 1 in 20 respondents rated their current jobs as providing the most meaningful work they could imagine. So 9 out of 10 people would salary sacrifice to have more meaning in their work. It seems obvious, and that's very much linked to the future of work. How do we create that meaning that really unlocks those skill sets? Because we know that with more engagement, we drive more productivity and we drive far better outcomes for our organisations. But our mindset remains our biggest challenge. When we had to work from home, we were able to do so. We were always able to do so. Equally, always working from home is not the answer either. You know, we know that throughout the period of COVID, there were real issues around isolation or lack of community or lack of connection. The workplace is a really rich environment to find that community and connection. But the key is to focus less on how people are doing their work or where they're doing their work, and more on what's the clarity of the expectation and how do you give trust. Because if people are trusted and they have clarity about what's expected, they'll figure out where the best place to work is. And that once again talks back to that mindset piece actually being the biggest unlock for most organisations. So I've gone through a whole lot of concepts very quickly as a bit of a thought prompter, and I'm really looking forward to getting into the conversation and the engagement. But I think the key for the future of work is understanding that if we want to stay competitive, if we want to be productive, we absolutely have to shift the way we think about working. We have to reimagine it. We have to think about how we empower and unlock the richness that sits within our organizations. And we need to understand the technologies and how we leverage them so we become more productive. And we need to trust that actually we have what we need. In New Zealand, we're uniquely placed. We're small enough that we can collaborate. We can think beyond the boundaries of teams. We can think beyond the boundaries of our organizations. You know, by collaborating and leveraging technologies and thinking differently about the way we work, I really believe that New Zealand can become increasingly productive and play a leadership role globally in this space. So look forward to the conversation with you all now.
Many thanks, Jo. That was a very fascinating presentation. I would now like to invite Nick Edlin to join in our Q&A session.
Kia ora, Jo, and thank you so much for the presentation. That sparked a lot of thought, not just for me, but for our audience as well, I'm sure. As Renisa mentioned at the outset, you have a long and significant career in executive roles, particularly with Fonterra. What led you to thinking about and consulting in the future of work? Was it a natural curiosity, or were there specific events or incidents that came up in your career that drove you in that direction?
Yeah, sure. There were probably two things that led to it. The first was when I came back from working offshore. I was running our Fonterra's ingredients business in Southeast Asia into the head of HR role. I was curious about our long-term path and what were the strategic capabilities that we would need to succeed over the longer term. And we didn't have a lot of work already in place around that. So I established a strategic capabilities function and actually brought in Vincent Villard, who is now my business partner. And we started to look at strategic capabilities for Fonterra, and then engaged with a number of other New Zealand organisations that were locally. And what we recognised was that all New Zealand organisations, and this is going back 4 or 5 years now, were really struggling with the same challenges, which was understanding or having an appreciation that the future was changing, but not being clear about where to start. The other key event for me was attending Singularity University at the end of 2017. And I did the executive program, which was a week-long course with global experts across a range of technologies and different areas. And it was a huge wake-up call for me that we just weren't having the conversations in New Zealand. You know, these technologies were not just 5, 10 years out, but living and breathing every day. You drive around San Francisco and you see self-driving cars. The technologies that we were talking about are actually here. And, you know, there's that lovely quote, you know, the future of work is here, but just not evenly distributed. And that's very much the case. So that combination of recognizing that most New Zealand organisations were grappling with, you know, how to take these practical steps, along with the fact that it didn't seem like we were as close or as understanding of the potential of the technologies as we might be, led to recognising the opportunity to actually step outside a single entity and work and partner with New Zealand organisations for New Zealand Inc. And that's what really drove FutureWork Studio to be set up, and Vincent and I obviously did that together.
So from that moment in time and the development of your consultancy and the work you've been doing in this area, I'm interested to know where you think New Zealand sits within the broader international context when it comes to the thinking and practice around future of work. You mentioned in your presentation that New Zealand's uniquely placed because of its size. How far along are we?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think it is a global challenge. I think all organisations globally in different ways are grappling with, you know, how to better prepare their organisations for this very fast-paced and ever-changing environment we're now in. I think in New Zealand we can at times be a little bit risk adverse, so we tend to sort of pause and, you know, has anyone done this? So I definitely think there's an opportunity for New Zealand organisations to experiment a little bit more. But at the same time, we have some inherent characteristics that position us really well, which is that we are small enough to learn quickly. We are globally connected, so we can see what's happening. You know, and we do have that great spirit when we want to unlock it to really try new things. So I think we're certainly ahead of many countries, but we certainly have opportunity at the same time.
I was fascinated in your insights around, I guess, the enduring traditional nature of our organizational structures. And you mentioned that, you know, in many cases it hews back to a 1950s sort of command and controlled style approach. So mindset is an obvious obstacle that you must encounter in your consultancy to organizations on future work. Can you expand on what some of those mindset challenges are, and indeed any other obstacles that you commonly come across?
Sure. Yeah, I think we have a mindset often that because the future of work feels like a big topic and technologies feel big, that the solution has to be big. And actually, what we're finding as we partner with organizations is small steps can make a huge difference. So, for example, we have a platform which enables projectization of the workforce. It enables people to connect and collaborate. And what we're finding is the engagement that's unlocked simply by giving people the opportunity to have some scope outside their day-to-day job. That already creates an energy and a different way of working. You know, there's huge skills in organizations that aren't visible. And when you give the opportunity for that visibility, it's amazing how quickly the transformation can take place. But you have to sort of take the first step. And what we find often is that, you know, organizations are looking for the big change and the silver bullet. And what we really encourage organizations to do is experiment, you know, take a step, see how it works, change up something a little bit different, let go. You know, I think one of the hardest things for many line leaders is when their recognition framework is built around, you know, how big is my team, how big is my P&L. It's quite hard to actually step back, put the ego on the back burner and really think about what would networking look like? What would it look like if I collaborated? I think we also have an opportunity in New Zealand to genuinely collaborate more across organisations. We have a little bit of not invented here, and we see that too. So we have a colleague who's done some fabulous work in the area of cooperation versus collaboration. And she always says that, well, she did a PhD in this area. And what her research showed was that New Zealand businesses are very good at cooperating, you know, playing nicely in the sandpit. We're very nice to each other. But actually true collaboration, where we come together with shared skin in the game, is something we're not as good at. And yet for a country our size, you know, we should be genuinely collaborating and working together for the good of New Zealand. You know, let's focus on competition out in the world and hit the global stage rather than often, you know, cutting up the pieces of the pie here in New Zealand. So for future of work, you know, the biggest things that we suggest are, you know, collaborate more, start to break down some of those silos, take some first steps, experiment, and leverage technology to unlock some of those, you know, opportunities, whether it's crowdsourcing talent or crowdsourcing ideas, for example.
So I understand your consultancy is across the economy as a whole. Do you perceive that different sectors have unique and different challenges, or are the challenges similar across organizations, industries, and sectors?
Yeah, it's a really great question. When we started, we had a hypothesis that actually it would be very different in different sectors. But some of our customers have actually proven to be in some of the most traditional sectors, you know, whether it's areas like energy or transport or infrastructure. And what it really comes down to is less about the industry or the sector and much more about the leadership mindset. So the organisations we're working with that are making some of these changes and really seeing very tangible improvements are organisations where the leaders have got the courage to actually take those steps, irrespective of sector or industry, which has been really interesting for us. So, yeah.
The Productivity Commission released a report on the future of work in March 2020, so arguably inauspicious timing just before COVID-19
Yes. Yeah.
really ramped up. I was reading through that report earlier this week, and one of the interesting things they said, and it touched on a point you mentioned in your presentation, was there isn't much sign of looming technological disruption. And if I just quote from the report, the Commission said faster technological progress would be evident in labour market and economic measures, such as productivity growth, occupational churn, and business startup rates. Mm-hmm. Do you agree with that finding of the Commission?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I do agree. We have seen that many organisations, probably because of cost and ROI concerns potentially in the first instance, have been slower to uptake technology or to see the benefits of technology. And yet in that same report, what the Commission really highlights is that one of the fastest unlocks for New Zealand to build productivity is to more strongly embrace technology. So while we're not seeing huge disruption yet, certainly we would expect that there is a lot of opportunity to more effectively embrace technology. New Zealand's productivity levels sit amongst the lowest in the OECD, and one of those reasons is very clearly that slow uptake. But I also think there's an interesting insight inherent in that word disruption. And I think that's also, once again, coming back to some of the barriers. And, adoption of technology doesn't need to be disruptive in terms of the workplace if it's planned for. So, for example, one of our customers we're working with is implementing RPA. And RPA, traditionally, the business case is, you introduce RPA and then you take cost out. And usually that's cost in terms of headcount. But in reality, you have to aggregate a lot of roles to crystallize that headcount. And what we're starting to look at is how do you move the focus from cost out to value creation. If you take hypothetically someone who's paid $60,000 a year in a core role, ultimately you can take one headcount out and save 60,000. But actually, what if you were to take the portion of that role and really amplify the value they can create by moving up the value chain? So moving from manual work to problem solving, to more proactive collaboration, to working differently with different parts of the organisation, or even leveraging that skill set into retraining for completely different roles. And so starting to shift that focus from cost and disruption to actually value creation, I think, is one of the big unlocks for New Zealand organisations.
If I just stick with some of the themes that came out of the Productivity Commission's report for a moment, because I think they do touch on a lot of the aspects you've been talking about. One is this point around education or retraining. And I think the Commission identified issues across the entire education chain. So one of their deep concerns was that core skill levels in schools were dropping, which should be of concern for all of us. And then also there was a need within the established tertiary education sector for more flexibility and accessibility in training. I'm interested in your reflections on both of those things, how future of work connects into the skills that people leave school with, and then also that ability to access tertiary education perhaps later in life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other link is obviously to the digital divide, which is increasingly spoken about, which is this differentiated experience that even here in New Zealand we're already seeing, particularly in Māori and Pacifica, but actually across the board when you take a socioeconomic lens. There's no doubt that schools have the opportunity to be far more connected to vocational application and the business workplace, and to strengthen those core skills, and move from understanding you know, a very traditional curriculum, if you like, to understanding the importance of problem solving and collaboration. And the earlier that students can be exposed to those types of skill sets, critical thinking. You know, one of the great examples of the importance of critical thinking is with fake news. You know, if you're a teenager today and you're bombarded by social media and you've got news and information coming from every quarter, you know, what are the critical thinking skills you can apply to understand where the truth lies and what the objectivity is? So these are all skills that, you know, schools have the opportunity to start teaching, and some are doing it really well. We did some work last year with Manurewa High School, who's really looking at the future of work and pulling that back to what are the opportunities for their students. Now, Manurewa is the largest, I think, Decile 1 school in New Zealand, and yet they are doing some really innovative work in this kind of area. So there's definitely schools doing some fantastic things, but more need to be investing in those areas. As it tracks through to universities, I think it's starting to think more about that practical application. You know, in days gone by, you could do a 3 or 4 year degree because the world was a lot more static in terms of how that knowledge would be applied. Today, information is changing so quickly, and it's also so accessible in terms of being able to go online and find information about almost anything, that the real opportunity then becomes, you know, how do you get more of a balance between theory and practical? So, you know, learn, apply, learn, apply. So maybe thinking quite differently, maybe university degrees become far more applied in the way perhaps teaching qualifications have always been done, where you have those really practical stints, and partnering more with businesses to understand what those real needs are and what those longer term needs are, I think is also really important.
I'm interested in your thoughts on how law and regulation fits into the broader context of where we're going to with work. And we've obviously seen the example of how privacy laws have lagged behind social media, for instance. When it comes to employment law and the way that New Zealand's employment law is currently constituted, is that acting as a handbrake to unlock some of this potential that you are consulting on, or is it broadly fit for purpose?
Yeah, look, I think there's definitely opportunity. You know, I think our employment law once again was developed in an era where there was far more stability. I think too, there's often a tendency to focus on the technology rather than the outcome of the technology. And actually the Productivity Commission report gives the great example of gig platforms. So the gig platforms in of themselves open up huge opportunity for people, because it enables people who may be marginalised on the outside because they're limited in the hours they can work or their ability to work on a regular basis. It opens up new opportunities. And in fact, a McKinsey report done several years ago showed that there were opportunities in the trillions of dollars by making work more accessible to people in small chunks. And platforms allow that to happen. They also allow people to have far more interesting and variable careers. There are increasing numbers of people who want to do work that has meaning and purpose and they're good at, and to pick and choose who they work with. So gig platforms are great opportunities for that. But often what the legislation is targeting is the lowest common denominator and an assumption of exploitation. But we have the opportunity to think differently. So the platforms in of themselves provide fantastic opportunities. How do we create the infrastructure around that enables protections? So for example, you know, if you're a gig worker, how do you access a mortgage? Well, let's leverage predictive analytics to look at your earnings record and partner with banks to be more flexible. You know, how do we make sure that you can access you know, safety net provisions if you're not a traditional worker? So there's this huge opportunity to look at the areas around employment law and around benefits, and recognise that technology in of itself is an enabler, and we just need to make sure our laws and our regulatory environment are fit for purpose.
I think that naturally leads on to another interesting point that came out of the Productivity Commission's report, was around the government needing to explore more options for what they called income smoothing, which in a way is possibly a euphemism for UBI, or universal basic income. And arguably we've had a version of that with the wage subsidy as a flow on from COVID. Do you have any particular views around the thinking and the necessity of UBI as it sits alongside the developments around future of work?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, and UBI was certainly very, very topical when the concerns were that automation were really going to take away whole jobs. And what we've seen is the shift, and as I talked about in the presentation, to actually the combination of an activities-based focus plus the emerging needs, whether it's for example with an aging population, there are new roles opening up in healthcare and other areas. So net, it looks like, for the foreseeable future, that there will continue to be very interesting jobs being developed and created. And hopefully that those concerns which would make a UBI essential are not coming to fruition. And I'm personally an optimist. I very much believe in the human condition, and believe that we always find ways. We are imaginative and creative, and there's always a way through. Having said that, there's no doubt that that transition may be very lumpy. So the lead lag between creation of new roles and then automation of activities or changes as a result of automation may be lumpy over a period of time. And having some form of smoothing is certainly an advantage if that's the case. And I think New Zealand has typically done that pretty well over time.
Thank you, Jo. I'll now hand over to Renisa, who can put forward some of the questions that have been coming in from the audience.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you, Nick. We have indeed had a number of questions and comments come through, and you both have sparked food for thought. To launch our questions, the first one is for you, Jo. In your experience, what has really helped senior leaders change their mindset regarding the future of work?
That's a great question. Probably that mindset of it doesn't have to be big and experimentation. That senior leaders who are willing to just try, and I think that certainly we saw that through working from home during COVID. We were on calls early on with customers and different people, and a very common sort of feedback at that time was, oh, wow, this does work. So I think there's a little bit of a fear of the unknown and a little bit of risk adversity often, and also that natural, if it's not broken, why fix it, which is that pull to the status quo. Senior leaders who are willing to just try something new, even if it's a small step, I think then find that it unlocks huge positive benefit and then continue on that journey. So trying, experimenting is what we would suggest for senior leaders, and recognizing that when you look at common purpose, actually if you take an organizational lens, the purpose of senior leaders are ultimately for the benefit of the whole organization or the enterprise. And trying to pull away from that very much, this is my P&L, my team, my control, to actually, how do I unlock the value of my team and what I can contribute for enterprise level benefit, is just a different lens too, that I think unlocks more appetite to try new things.
That's really interesting. And reflecting on some of the comments around the Productivity Commission and other elements from a legislative lens, the next question correlates to those themes. It's also for you, Jo. What role do you think the government can play to put the future of work discussion as a priority? And then the follow-up to that is, what is the government doing well, and what would you like to see them do more of?
Look, I think we're lucky with this government that there is a very high awareness of the future of work. Even before coming into power, probably even before they knew they would. Labour released a report on the future of work that really recognised that there needed to be changes and we needed to be thinking differently. And certainly there's been huge investment behind, for example, the Business Advisory Council, which was a business leaders forum that have come up with really practical ways that New Zealand can transition. And for anyone who hasn't read the McKinsey research that underpinned the Business Advisory Council report, feel free to message me directly, or I can make it available through Carriage. It's an excellent report with very practical suggestions, very much endorsed by the by the government, which are around investing behind reskilling, training, a more vocational lens. So I think we do have a government that is very aware of the importance of future of work. I mean, obviously, it's been an unusual year or two, shall we say? So you know, it's perhaps not as high up the priority list currently, but I think it will come back, and I think there is very strong awareness of its importance.
Thank you. I personally was quite fascinated by this statistic as well, and it seems the participants have resonated with it. It's regarding the stat that people are willing to salary sacrifice to do more meaningful work. The question is, I would love to talk to my leadership team more about this. Have you changed mindsets around this previously, and do you have any advice on how to tackle it?
Yeah. It's an interesting one. The thing that really resonates with me about that statistic is there can be an assumption that that applies primarily to traditionally sort of office-based workers, but actually some of the biggest unlock has come in research through engaging people in more traditional manual work, for example. There's a great study where I think it was done with electrical engineers or similar, but field-based, where simply by bringing that group of people into contributing ideas around how their work could be more meaningful and how that change could take place, there was a 3.5% improvement as a result of some of those ideas that translated to multi-millions of dollars on the bottom line. So I think there's a twofold. I think one is meaningful work and purpose is about engagement and recognizing the contribution everyone can make and giving people more of a say. Most people, no matter what role they're in, really want to have the opportunity to shape their environment. I think when you're talking to a senior leadership team, it's bringing some of those practical examples, but I think also making it easy. You know, often when we talk, and something I'm very conscious of with my HR background is often it's easy to talk at a conceptual level, but actually what does it mean tangibly and practically? You know, and we've seen that, for example, once again with one of the customers we're working on with our Hive platform, which enables people to contribute in different parts. We've seen, you know, tangible feedback about the benefits of having people contributing from other parts of the organization, creating meaning for those individuals, and also, for example, in the rewriting of a proposal where you get a wider or more diverse skill set. The other way is thinking about areas like, you know, just small steps, you know, what would make something more meaningful, and, you know, mentoring and coaching is a very simple step most organizations can take as well. So making it manageable, real and small enough, I think, and then talking about the real tangible upside benefits. Yeah.
The next question also ties into your background in HR. The question is, how can HR play a role to educate the leadership team that the organization needs to really start looking at the future of work and its implications as a key employee value proposition?
I think it's actually a very similar answer, which is, you know, the future of work feels very conceptual, but what do we really mean by the future of work? Well, by the future of work, we mean there's the opportunity to unlock capacity within the organization by automating low value tasks and then leveraging that capacity for higher value. You know, through technology or other impacts, we have the opportunity to create a more engaged workforce, you know, and there's a wealth of research on the productivity benefits of an engaged workforce. You know, through, you know, diversity and inclusion lens, we have the opportunity to bring different voices. And there's a wealth of research that gives very tangible examples around the benefits of having more diverse voices at the table. So I think it's that taking the future of work and breaking it down into the very tangible elements of the future of work, and then a few key starting points. And, you know, we always say to our customers, go where the energy is. You know, don't try and do a big bang. Don't force everyone in a direction. find out who your champions are, find out where the energy is, start some experiments. And what you find is that through viral adoption, things start to shift very, very quickly.
That's really interesting. The next two questions, understandably, have reflected on the COVID-19 context specifically. The first one is, there's a lot of talk about people needing to transfer skills from one sector to the other in light of what's happened. The question to you, Jo, is do you believe employers and recruiters are open to it in New Zealand when traditionally one tends to be pigeonholed to one industry?
Yeah. I do think that is a challenge. I think it's changing slowly, but we have huge opportunity. And the more examples we can demonstrate, the more people will see that. I think the future of work and understanding that is less about your CV and your vertical, moves, and more about what you can offer and what you can contribute. And once again, starting within an organization and creating the opportunities for people to demonstrate the ability to contribute outside the area, opening up and collaborating is a great first step. And then as people see that being normalized, I think, expanding that across organizations. We're working with a group of organizations at the moment where actually they're starting to will create opportunities for employees to work across the different organizations in small bite-sized chunks. And what you see there is this huge benefit of learning, bringing it back to your core job, seeing that actually people can contribute outside that narrow box we put people in. I experienced it myself when I came back from having worked in a line role to HR. And actually my 15 years experience before I had moved into general management had been in HR. But people who'd only known me in that line capacity said to me, Jo, HR, how will you go? And I think that that's the challenge, is we only see what people are doing right now and we make assessments. So how do you unlock and democratize, the full suite of what people can offer is really important. And I think recruiters will get there, but organizations can start role modeling that first, because recruiters will always take their lead from organizations anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm conscious of time, and this next question's a biggie around behavioral change. So I think we can spend a bit of time dwelling on it. Now that everyone's effectively reverted back to business as usual in level 1 and operating how we did pre-COVID, what can we do to impress on leaders the importance of reimagining the business and the workforce in the context of future of work?
Yes, it's a great question. I've been really intrigued. We had all these conversations during COVID around the benefits, that many people were experiencing from working from home, going for work, better balance, and so on. And organizations saw the benefits. And then so many organizations, as soon as we came back to level 1, have gone right back to the way we always did things. So it is an interesting human behavior that I think we have the skew always to the status quo. I think it's about not managing to the extremes. We tend to, everyone worked from home. Obviously we had to. It wasn't truly working from home in the flexible working context because people had no choice. Ideally what we want is to give choice. So my business partner uses the term location agnostic working, which is a really nice term, which is once again helping organizations focus on the outputs. I think some of the reason why working from home hasn't always worked well is because managers don't always give very good clarity. So, to have trust, you need to be sure that people are going to deliver outcomes, and to deliver outcomes, you need to make sure people have clarity. So taking more of a systemic approach, I think would be very helpful. What are the barriers, understanding the barriers, but fundamentally trust and clarity, I think, need to underpin the way anyone works. And then experimenting. What's the worst thing that could happen? Someone isn't as productive, well then change it. I think taking away some of that fear is really important. So.
It's a good message to end on, and a good challenge to all of us as well to keep that in mind as we navigate forward. Our apologies we couldn't answer all the questions that have come through. Thank you so much for the input. Thank you so much, Joe, and to Nick. In our closing, we'd love to invite you to our webinar next week, which pivots from the theme of leadership conversations with executives to instead bring some outside-in thinking to you. We will be speaking to two of New Zealand's world champion rowers, Kelsey Bevan and Grace Prendergast, regarding lessons learned from high-performance sport and resilience after setbacks, and explore how those insights can be translated into a business context. Thank you to everybody who has suggested topics that they would like to see us cover. We have gathered that data and will develop a pipeline accordingly. We would be very grateful if you could please fill out a short survey for feedback on this webinar. We will send an email with the link. And very importantly, we want to thank our team behind the scenes who manage the technology and bring these webinars to life. Thank you so much, Amelia and Paul. Finally, we look forward to staying connected online or in person. Until then, stay safe. Kia kaha.